So we talked about the need to recognize or tune into the Christ consciousness, because it's really only the Christ consciousness that can give us that frame of reference for something that is beyond the human consciousness, the duality consciousness, the death consciousness. So there's a very important sequence in Matthew that talks about this. So in chapter 16:13, we have, when Jesus came into the coasts of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" Notice that he refers to himself as the Son of Man. And they said, "Some say thou art John the Baptist, some Elias, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." He said unto them, "But whom say ye that I am?" And Simon Peter answered and said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered and said unto him, "Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven." So I'll just stop there, because the thing is, we have here Jesus asking, "Who do people say that I am?" And people have various theories about who he is. But then Peter says, "Thou art Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "Flesh and blood has not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven." And that's the essence of how we recognize Christ. Because as I've said, the duality consciousness, the human intellect, can come up with all kinds of arguments. So you can you can argue endlessly for Christ, against Christ. And this is what the scribes and the Pharisees did, and that's why they ended up rejecting Jesus, because, as I said, they had adopted a certain truth, a certain dualistic truth, that had elevated to the status of not being relative, but being absolute. And they were not willing to question it. So here comes Jesus asking them, or really challenging them to question that truth, and they won't do it. So they use their intellects and the duality consciousness to rationalize and reason why they can reject Jesus. So it's important to realize here, you can see people, and I talked about it in the previous talk about intellectuals that are arguing intellectually. So you have many of those in the scientific materialist camp, but you also have many in religious camps, including Christians. And you can see, if you look back at history, you can see many of these arguments that Christians have come up with. There are some arguments for, I think it was Thomas Aquinas, who came up with these arguments for God's existence, arguments for why God must exist. And it's very, very intellectual, and you can look at these arguments and say, "Oh yeah, I think that's true," or you can say, "Oh yeah, I don't think it's true." But it's all intellectual argumentation. And when you start doing that with Christ and the Christ mind, you are using the mind of Antichrist, the death consciousness, to argue for or against the existence of the Christ mind or a particular expression of the Christ mind. And that will never get you anywhere. It'll just keep you in that state of consciousness where you are so trapped in argumentation. That's what, as I said, there's the emotional, the mental, and the identity level. And the identity level can keep you there, arguing back and forth for the rest of this lifetime, if you want. And that's, of course, not what Jesus wanted. But the only way out of that is to reach up for the Christ mind, or reach within, I should say, for the Christ mind, and contact the Christ mind, so that you see, at least in a glimpse, that there's something here. And that's why Jesus said, "Flesh and blood has not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven," which could be interpreted to be the universal Christ consciousness, or a particular spiritual being. But so this is important to realize. There is what Jesus called flesh and blood, which is really the duality consciousness, the mind of separation, the mind of Antichrist, that reasons, argues about Christ and the statements of Christ. whether it's true or not. And it can go on indefinitely. So we go on here. And I say also unto thee, that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then charged he his disciples that they should tell no man that he was Jesus the Christ. Okay, so this quote, that what I have read so far, is what the Catholic Church basically uses to justify its entire existence. Really, seriously. Because they say, they trace their lineage back to Peter, and it's in the scriptures that Peter came to Rome and he was crucified there. And so the Catholic Church says that he was the first pope. Now, I challenge you to find the word pope in the New Testament. I can't find it. Or rather, the search engines can't find it. And so Jesus never talked about this. He never said, Peter, you're the Pope. But anyway, they trace their lineage of popes back. There's actually quite a big gap in the, I think, 200s. But nevertheless, they trace their lineage back, and they're saying, because Jesus gave the keys to the kingdom to Peter, the Catholic Church has the keys to the kingdom, therefore it's the only true church, and it's the only one that can get you into the kingdom. However, that's not the mystical interpretation of this entire passage. Because what have I said in previous talks? I've said, as a safety mechanism for allowing us to outplay our free will, everything was created out of the universal Christ mind. Which means, even if we go into what I call the consciousness of separation, which Jesus called the death consciousness, we can find our way back because we have access to the Christ mind within us, in the kingdom that is within us. And everybody has that ability. Everybody has that ability, not just Peter. So, what we see here in this passage is that Peter had used this ability, and therefore he recognized that the universal Christ mind was expressing itself through Jesus. And therefore, Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God. What's really, as I've said before, the only begotten Son of the living God is really the universal Christ consciousness, but I also said the universal Christ consciousness needs to be expressed through an individual in embodiment. And that individual then is the Christ in embodiment. And it's not exclusive to Jesus. It's not exclusive to Jesus. And Jesus says several times, I can of my own self do nothing. As I hear, I speak. As I do, it's not me, but the Father doing it through me. So Jesus is very, very careful to say, I don't have a monopoly on the Christ consciousness. In fact, I'm not really the Christ, I'm an open door for the Christ mind. So what Jesus is really saying here is that upon this rock will I build my church, upon the rock of every person's ability to tune into the Christ mind in themselves and therefore recognize the Christ in someone else. So in other words, how could Peter recognize the Christ in Jesus unless he had momentarily tuned into the Christ in himself? We all have that ability. And that's the only way you can recognize a higher truth of Christ, a higher understanding of Jesus' teachings is through the Christ mind in yourself. I'm not asking you to believe anything I say here. If it resonates with you, then you go with it. If it doesn't, go your way. So the rock upon which Jesus will build his church is not the outer person of Peter Just as the outer person of Jesus doesn't have a monopoly on the Christ consciousness, the outer person of Peter doesn't have a monopoly on recognizing Christ. So it's actually all of us having the ability to recognize Christ. That is the rock upon which Jesus will build his church. And Jesus' church is not an outer earthly human institution. It's an inner church where we are walking that inner path into the kingdom that is within us. That is the Church of Christ. Church of Christ cannot be confined to or monopolized by an earthly institution. That is the entire flaw, not only in the Catholic Church, but in most other Christian churches and in most other religions. Most religions think, we are the only true church. We have a monopoly on God or Christ. And it's simply a flat-out lie. It comes from the death consciousness, the duality consciousness. So Peter is being, in this situation, a symbol for the ability we all have to recognize Christ. And therefore, when Jesus says, I will give unto thee the keys to the kingdom of heaven, it doesn't mean that Peter is the only one who has the keys to the kingdom. It means our ability to recognize Christ within ourselves. That's the keys to the kingdom. Again, no earthly institution can monopolize it. And this means what? It means no earthly institution can prevent you from discovering the kingdom of God that is within you. And no earthly institution can guarantee your entry into the kingdom. All this is human nonsense. And you will see this very shortly. So, we go further in Matthew 16. From that time forth began Jesus to shew unto his disciples how that he must go unto Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised again the third day. Then Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee. But he Jesus turned and said unto Peter, Get thee behind me, Satan. Thou art an offense unto me, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but the things that be of men. Now you see, this is rather important. First Jesus says, Thou art the rock upon which I'll build my church, which the Catholic Church always mentions. But then he says, Get thee behind me, Satan, to the same Peter. Was Jesus schizophrenic? Or is there a deeper mystical meaning here? And the deeper mystical meaning is, of course, as I said, in the first quote, Peter uses the ability we all have to recognize the Christ in Jesus. That's the keys to the kingdom. That's the rock upon which Jesus will build his church. All of us having that ability. But then in the second quote, now what Jesus is doing, now what Peter is doing is, instead of being willing to engage in the path of removing the beam in his own eye, the elements of the duality consciousness, he is now using the duality consciousness to create an idolatrous image of Jesus. That Jesus is this elevated Christ who is going to fulfill a certain role in Peter's mind, and therefore it just doesn't correspond to Peter's elevated image of Christ that he should be arrested and killed and humiliated. So what Peter is doing is, even though he has recognized the Christ in Jesus, he is now taking elements of the consciousness of Antichrist, forming an image and projecting it upon Jesus. He's essentially saying to Jesus, Jesus is the one who's telling his disciples what's going to happen to him. And Peter's saying, oh no, Jesus, you're wrong about that. This is not going to happen to you. Because this would offend my image of you. And it would offend my image of how elevated I am as your disciple because I was able to recognize you. And Jesus says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Because in that moment, Peter represents the consciousness of Satan. And what is it that the consciousness of Satan wants to do to Christ? Listen carefully here. Okay? What have I said? We have been given free will. We have been allowed to go into the consciousness of separation, which is Satan. Essentially what Jesus calls Satan. I'm not saying there isn't a certain being that represents that state of consciousness, but it's in the broadest understanding of Satan is the duality consciousness, the consciousness of separation, the consciousness of death. That's Satan. And in the consciousness of Satan, there has been created this completely false image of everything. Of life, the world, of God, of salvation, and of the Christ consciousness. And the consciousness of Satan wants everybody to conform to this image, this worldview, including Jesus. But Jesus comes to represent the Christ consciousness, and as I've said, the function of the Christ consciousness is everything is created out of the Christ consciousness, which means if we use our free will to go into the consciousness of separation, we can always find our way back to oneness by contacting the Christ mind within us. That is the key to the kingdom, that to re-entering the kingdom, or rather overcoming the illusion that we were ever separated from it. So the Christ consciousness comes from outside the duality consciousness in order to offer us the way out of duality. But what the consciousness of Satan wants to do is to get the Christ, the representative of Christ, to conform to the worldview created from duality. So here's Jesus. He is representing the Christ in embodiment. And Satan, through Peter, wants Jesus to conform to Peter's worldview, which is based on duality. Peter essentially, in that moment, thinks he knows better than Jesus what's going to happen to Jesus. And that's the essence of the satanic consciousness. It thinks it knows better than God how the world works or should work. And right there, you have the central question of the Christian religion, the central challenge of the Christian religion. You can say that in this quote here, there are two challenges of Christ that are illustrated. The first challenge is, can we recognize Christ? And with that I mean actually something profound. Can we recognize that Christ is beyond our normal state of consciousness, our normal worldview? Basically, is it beyond duality? Because if Jesus was just another preacher like the scribes and Pharisees, well, there'd be really nothing special about him, right? So he has something special because he has tuned into the Christ mind. He is an open door for the Christ mind. And the first challenge to Christ is to recognize that. Now, Peter passed that challenge. His other disciples supposedly also. The scribes and Pharisees failed it. Most people who met Jesus failed it. But the second challenge of Christ is, once we have recognized that there's something special about Christ, what are we supposed to do? We are supposed to use that direct experience of Christ, the universal Christ mind expressing itself through Jesus, supposed to use that as a frame of reference for questioning the beam in our own eye, the dualistic illusions. So that one by one, we let these illusions die. We give up that life in order to follow Christ. One by one, this is the second challenge of Christ. Are we willing to let the sense of self, the sense of identity we have based on the consciousness of Antichrist, are we willing to systematically use our experience of Christ as a frame of reference for questioning all these illusions? Or do we seek to use the authority of Christ to validate our illusions? Just think about what I just said. Do we use Christ to challenge our illusions, or do we seek to use Christ to validate our illusions? That is the central challenge of the Christian religion. And so far, the vast majority of Christian churches have completely failed it. Completely. They haven't even started recognizing that challenge. The Catholic Church, after 17 centuries, still completely enveloped in the illusion that Peter was the first pope and he has the keys to the kingdom, and therefore the Catholic Church has the keys to the kingdom. They haven't even begun to ask themselves what it meant that Jesus called Peter Satan. So this is really, I mean, when you really grasp this, I remember first when I grasped this, I was just shocked. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I thought, how can this be after 17 centuries? No major Christian church has gotten this. I mean, I know there are Christian mystics who have understood it, have grasped it. I'm not saying I'm the only one, obviously. But how can it be that none of the bigger churches have acknowledged this? And this shows you the power of the duality consciousness. Because what people are doing, they are using the duality consciousness to create this idolatrous image of what Christ is and what Christ represents, what Jesus was, what Jesus represents, and they are projecting it upon the real Jesus and his real teachings and his real mission. And it is so subtle, so persuasive, that the vast majority of Christians, probably 99% of Christians, haven't even started suspecting that there's any problem with what they're doing. And it's really mind-boggling. It can be that subtle. But it shows you the power of how people reinforce these illusions. And it actually shows you what the Christian churches have done from the Catholic Church and forward. What did I say? What is the keys to the kingdom? It's the ability to recognize Christ, and each and every one of us has that ability. But what the Christian religion has done is to cause most people to suppress that ability by saying, oh, but I can't know what's real and unreal. I can't know what's true. Only the authority figures of the church can know. So I better follow them. Then, after all, I'm guaranteed to be saved. Or at least that's what they say. You see that? The Christian religion has done the absolute opposite of what Jesus wanted. They have not only destroyed Jesus' original message and teachings, but they have destroyed people's ability to see the lies promoted by the Christian religion. It's literally a double indemnity. It's a catch-22. The only way to see the fallacy of the Christian religion is to have a direct experience of Christ, the Christ mind. But the Christian religion has been so effective on making people believe they can't have that. Or at least they can't have it in a way that contradicts the doctrines and the worldview of the church. And so many people have believed this, and they are still sitting in their churches every Sunday, blindly following the blind leaders. And think about what I said about the straight and narrow path and the wide gate, the broad way. What Jesus said was, if the blind lead the blind, they shall both end up in the ditch. Well, here you have a very narrow road, and there's a ditch on either side. And in order to follow the narrow road, you have to keep your vision focused on Christ, because if you go into duality, you will end up either in that ditch or that ditch. And that's where most Christians have been for the past 17 centuries. And that's where the majority of Christian churches are today. So your question is, the question for you is, will you listen to what is being said here and use it to activate your ability to recognize Christ within yourself? Or will you argue against what I'm saying and try to make Christ conform to your pre-existing worldview? Are you willing to let your current sense of life die in order to follow Christ? Or will you use an idolatrous image of Christ to validate staying in that illusion, in that death consciousness?